This video is going to show you how to install digital triggers to your Sony DS4 controller. If you saw my last video, you'll kind of have an understanding of how this process will work. The key difference is that a lot more modifications will have to be made to your controller. Most of the tools from my digital bumper video will be used again. And if you haven't seen that video, don't worry, I will show basically the complete process for installing your very own digital triggers. The tools you will need are as follows: a 00 Phillips screwdriver, tweezers, and X-Acto knife, wire cutters, as well as cable cutting pliers. And two of the most important things you need when doing any type of mods to a controller are a hot glue gun with some hot glue and a soldering iron. You'll also need some solder, flux to help your solder flow a lot better, and I like to use toothpicks to help handle the flux as well as the hot glue, and 30 AWG solid wire. There is different types of wire that you can use, however 30 AWG solid wire is very thin and easy to manipulate, perfect for modding controllers. The actual parts we will be using are the Omron micro switches, or otherwise known as M905 switch, and you'll need some sort of remapper chip and something that you can use to mold into a solid shape. I use this JB Weld epoxy putty called Steel Stick. It is perfect for making solid shapes that we will be using as mounts for our micro switches. Start by removing the 4 screws on the back to open up your controller. Once pried open, you will very carefully remove the ribbon cable that connects your controller LED and battery port to your motherboard. This cable is pretty sensitive, so be cautious when handling it. After that, remove the battery and the single screw that holds the motherboard together with the controller. Now that your controller is apart, you can see how the stock triggers work. This particular controller has been worked on, so don't worry about it looking different than yours. I'll pull up some old footage to show you what you need to do to prepare your triggers for their upgrade. So here's my old footage from my digital bumpers video. All I'm doing right here is removing the rubber contact pads, and then I'm going to cut away the portion of the PCB that controls the triggers and bumpers. So once you do that, your controller is no longer going to work like it used to. So if you're not prepared, or if you don't have all the tools, don't do this. You can probably just leave that part in there, glue over it if you want, or you can just order an extra one off eBay. It's not a big deal, they're only a few dollars. Here is where you want your micro switch to sit, so when you press your R2 and L2, the switch is instantly engaged. To make sure this will work, we're going to need to use our epoxy putty to create a mold that will support our micro switch. If you decide to use the JB Weld steel stick, just cut out a small piece and mix it together by hand. The color and consistency will change, and it will even start to heat up in your hands. The goal is to make small rectangular block shapes. We can cut them as they begin to dry. Lots of alterations will need to be made to get your epoxy putty shapes exactly the way we need them to support the Omron switches. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be functional. Basically, you're trying to recreate a half trapezoid type shape. If you had a 3D printer or maybe even some Legos, you could probably make something that could work just as effectively. I like to cut the feet off the bottom of the micro switches. It makes it a little bit easier to work with when you start gluing these to your mounts. After you cut your mounts to a shape that you like, you want to start mocking it up to see if you can get it to fit, and then adjusting as you go. It's going to take a while. This is probably the most intense process, is just getting it to fit perfectly. From there, you're going to hot glue your switches to these mounts. Be careful not to get any glue in the actuator, that little blue part on the switch. Hold it, make sure it dries nice and good. If you have compressed air, that helps a lot with hot glue. You can just blow it on there, it'll dry a lot faster. That's also where the toothpicks come in handy. Tweezers. These claw things that I have holding, you can just buy one of those off Amazon, or you don't really need those. You just need something to hold it in place. Those will help though. The goal that you're trying to achieve is for the switch to be instantly engaged as soon as you press your trigger, just like a mouse click. So when you're mocking up, keep that in mind. You want the end of your trigger to rest on that blue part so that when you press down, it instantly engages. So this can take a while. Just be patient. You'll get it eventually. And you'll see kind of the shape that I made. It's really awkward. Once you're happy with your results and you've gotten the mount with the switch to fit pretty reasonably, you're going to start getting everything ready to be soldered. So put some flux on the end of your switches, cut the ends of your wires, and then just solder the wires to the switches, and we'll go from there. At some point throughout this entire process, make sure to pre-solder your remap chip. This one's already been used, so you can kind of see those little balls of solder. You want to do this first so that you can more easily solder your wires to this PCB. Once you have the wires soldered to your switches, you're going to hot glue those switches underneath your triggers. Make sure to get a good fit. Use more glue if you need to. Once your mounts with the switches are glued in place, twist your wires together to make them easier to work with, and then begin soldering the wires to the PCB board. One of your wires from each switch is going to go to the L2 or R2, and then one will go to the ground plane. Depending on what remapper you use, they may look different, but they should all indicate where you need to solder. So just keep that in mind. Your remap chip may look different than this one. After everything is done and you've started to put your controller back together, you're going to notice that the back shell won't close properly anymore. In order to make it work, you're going to have to cut off some of the plastic on the rear shell. Once you've gotten your shells to close, you're going to want to make sure that everything is functioning properly. All the buttons, the triggers especially. I like to use gamepadtester.com to make sure all my inputs are working. If you have any issues at all with your buttons not working, you're going to want to recheck all your soldering and make sure that your remapper is perfectly aligned, because that usually is one of the biggest issues. If that remapper is not perfectly aligned between your controller motherboard and its blue PCB, sometimes your buttons won't work. So double check those two things. Sometimes it can be something simple. Other times you might have messed something up as you went. But just be careful when you're doing all these mods. This can be a pretty difficult mod if you don't have the right tools. However, this video should show you that it can be done. Make sure to get plenty of extra switches in case you break any, and maybe even an old controller to practice on. Controllers are very fragile, so it is highly likely you will break something if you're not careful. But in my opinion, nothing compares to the instant mouse click response digital triggers will give you. So definitely worth it if you can pull it off. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing, and you'll be notified as I continue to upload controller mods. Next video, I will be installing tactile back buttons to this controller, so stay tuned.